أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Welcome everyone to another MuslimARC live broadcast. Today we're going to talk with three amazing Muslim women organizers. Unfortunately, Ashanor could not be here. Please keep her in your dua, your prayers for her health and speedy recovery. So today we have three women that I know have done just amazing work. I've worked with, I met in real life, and we've shared deeply, and their work inspires my work. And so I'm gonna actually let them introduce themselves. Yeah, I guess we'll start with Aber. Can you share a little bit about the work that you do?
Okay, sure. Thanks for putting me on the spot first.
Yeah.
All right, assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Aber Kawas. I'm 25 years old from Brooklyn, New York. I have been working within Muslim communities and Arab communities for over about 6 to 7 years now formally, but really consider myself somebody who's been involved in community since I was a kid and didn't really know what I was doing. Formally, right now I am the advocacy director of the Take on Hate campaign in New York City. The Take on Hate campaign is under the National Network of Arab American Communities. And before that, I was a community organizer at the Arab American Association of New York. Most of what I did consisted of organizing the Arab community around policies such as immigration policies, police reform policies, or policies around Islamophobia. And I'm currently continuing that work with Take on Hate and really focusing on building coalition within New York City around Islamophobia with our communities, but also moving our communities to doing racial justice work, not just within kind of the guise of Arab or Muslim, but really expanding out of that.
It's amazing. I mean, especially starting out so young. I mean, and you have so many years of experience. So let's go to Hoda. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organizing work?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Hoda Katebi. I'm 22, based in Chicago, but born and raised in Oklahoma. I work as a political fashion blogger at JooJoo Azad. And I also had the communications department at CARE Chicago. And I'm a community organizer with Muslims Organize and For the People Organize, or For the People Artists, sorry. And so a lot of my work in all of my areas is a lot of just kind of talking about a lot of issues that are related to anti-Muslim racism, specifically in media and communications. So I know that a lot of individual hatred against Muslims comes from what you see in the media or representation, and especially right now, the Muslim identity is hot and sexy and everyone wants to have a part of it. Large corporations are draping hijabs over their models just to tap into a dollar or tap into this branding. And so a lot of my work is also just here to remind Muslims that we're whole and we're capable and we don't need to settle for less. Because a lot of times, our community tends to normalize violence as a community and settle for something that is kind of handed to us by a corporation saying this is inclusion. And so being able to kind of take that apart and challenge these false representation or surface level inclusion by media or corporations, but also organizing on a state-based level against racism as a whole.
Oh, excellent.
She's younger than me.
Now you're no longer the youngest one in the room.
I used to get props for that, but no longer.
Yeah, mashallah. Okay, May, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. And I am officially the oldest person here. To learn from the solidly millennial generation. I've been in this work. God, I liked hearing your story, Aber, about being unable to distinguish the moment you became politically activated. It was kind of something similar for me because my father was very involved in the local political community, going to city council meetings, bringing me, forcing me to sing America the Beautiful at a city council meeting. Consider that a part of like child abuse, but it's really interesting to see the divergent tracks of the political work that I was introduced to and what of the work I do now. But I was very much politicized around local politics, and I would only agree to go to political fundraisers if I could belly dance. And so those were the early days of negotiation and compromise on my part. So there was that induction. When I was in college, I began organizing kind of around a cultural diverse, multicultural sort of coalition of activists during the start of the Iraq War at UCLA. And UCLA is a campus that is probably less known than Berkeley, but I would argue even indeed in its history of student activism. So a South African freedom fighter who was part in South was in terms of student organizers. So that really influenced the way that I saw movements more broadly. In this moment during the Iraq War, right after 9/11, there was a sense of Arabs being under attack, and I started to connect with Arab activism and organizing. But my work actually became more influenced by prison abolition activism and organizing. And when I was in New York, I started working with this organization called Blackout Arts Collective, and we used art as a tool for social change. And one of our biggest campaigns was working within the prisons with incarcerated youth using critical literacy, kind of Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal teachings to facilitate conversations around the prison industrial complex inside the biggest penal colony in all of America at Rikers Island. So my activism kind of spanned issues, organizing wise too, but I think thematically what was at the heart were things that I was introduced to in my early sort of maturation around activism, and that was the power of using art, the power of understanding actually Islam. I didn't talk about that in my sort of intro, but through my study of Malcolm X and through organizing within like Hijabi Monologues, which is a play that is still going on today that features the stories of Muslim American women, and really inspired by the message of faith and commitment to the oppressed in Islam. Regardless of what the topic is, I've always kind of seen things in an intersectional lens because of my understanding of our faith.
That's fabulous. So, you know, some of our viewers or people that will end up watching the show or reading, they may see activism in a kind of negative lens, where they see things like, people with bullhorns that protest. So I wouldn't, let's explore kind of what is community organizing, the official definition, and then, what does it mean in the context of your work? So maybe we can start with Hoda, because you are in Chicago, right? So you've done a lot of, and that's where a lot of the kind of traditional schools of organizing comes from. So I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of what is the official work of organizing, and how does that differ from what is imagined, especially in the Muslim community around activism. Uh-oh, you're on mute.
I kept laughing at people's funny comments, so I was like, I should mute myself. So definitely, yeah, I think community organizing, especially in Chicago with a lot of the organizations that I'm involved with, really the purpose is to actively fight for, work towards, and build the world that you want to live in, whether or not you'll be able to see this world within your lifetime. So it means active imagination and centering arts, just like Maz said, and innovation and creativity, and also knowing your history of where you came from, knowing what happened in that city, what happened to your people, where you came from, the ancestors that you're kind of recalling in a lot of these spaces. And it also means like centering community education and empowerment, and really making sure that we're not speaking to people. You know, we're with people. We're in a community. We shouldn't be using theoretical concepts to talk about very real issues when that can isolate or take people out and exclude people from these spaces. And so we need to make sure that all of our work is centering those who are most on the outside, and those who are most sitting at these expectations of harm. So for example, someone who's Muslim receives more state-based harm than someone who is not Muslim. Someone who's Black and Muslim receives even more state-based harm in different sorts of ways than someone who is just Muslim and white passing, like myself. And so understanding that there are layers also in people's identities and people's experiences of harm at the state, and really hoping and working to challenge state-based violence by centering those voices who are most impacted and who are most traditionally on the margins. So trans people, for example, intersex people, people with disabilities, and all of these sorts of intersections of identities. But for a lot of my work, I work on challenging anti-Muslim racism through an abolitionist perspective. So knowing that anti-Muslim racism has a root in anti-Black racism. So there is absolutely no way I can challenge anti-Muslim racism without being very actively engaging in anti-Black racism and being in solidarity with my Black sisters and brothers and siblings. But also knowing that there's not going to be liberation, there's not going to be freedom when these institutions of oppression still exist. So there's no way that I'm going to be free if drones, for example, are still being manufactured, or the drone industry is still going to be manufactured, or police and prisons. Like there's no way that a Muslim person can be free if we have prisons in this country. And so knowing the intersections of identities and the intersections of what that harm leads to, and then being able to challenge that by centering those voices. And also something I think that especially happens in the Muslim community is that we treat other Muslims in organizing spaces or just in our spaces as disposable. And I think this is something that organizing, especially sort of like imaginative community organizing, really needs to be making sure that we are not doing, is that we don't treat people as disposable, and we're really centering people who would otherwise be seen as disposable. And a lot of times this happens in Muslim spaces by seeing other Muslims as disposable. So for example, in like cultural centers or aid centers or refugee and asylum seeking centers, we oftentimes, a lot of the volunteers who are here, we oftentimes don't really care to make sure that Muslim volunteers are retained in these organizations. We're more focused on keeping white people there because we're so thankful that a white person is here to help. And so making sure that we are not really settling for a lot of these problematic sorts of kinds of community organizing, and really making sure that we're working with and centering those who are actively working to build with.
Nice.
Okay, that's good. Aber, can you define, because I mean, we have a lot of different working definitions of community organizing. So maybe can you define what is community organizing and what is it to you?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, snaps to Hoda, because now I got to follow that up. Had a lot in there, mashallah. I mean, it's interesting that you're asking this question, because it's something that I feel like I reflect on a lot coming into the world. And like, I think a lot of us, we start off kind of just wanting to do things, and then we kind of get sucked into this world of like nonprofits or collectives, and organizing is like this buzzword that, gets assigned to you all of a sudden, and it means something in these spaces. And we're also dealing with a time where organizing is something that's becoming really professionalized, right? Like I work as an organizer, I get paid to do organizing, and what does that mean? And, you know, how is that different than what's going on? So firstly, I just think that one of the things I try to remember is that community organizing is something that can be completely, and not can be, like totally is completely something that is informal. And I really believe is a way that our community is really dealing with capitalism and the isolation that comes with the way that the world kind of is organized today, where people, you know, where, you know, like these systems really thrive off of our isolation, us not being connected with one another, us not being connected with our identities, us not kind of being able to congregate together. And subhanAllah, for me, Islam was something that always taught me about the idea of community being together, just from the way that our community kind of does congregate and what like masajid have always meant to our community, but also historically looking at our ancestors, and not just Muslim ancestors, but like throughout time, people have always found ways to gather, you know, and find spirituality and meaning in those gatherings, and also like make change within those gatherings. So one, I think that it's something that's completely informal. For myself, though, I think I went through a journey of trying to understand that, because I think when I was a teenager, I used to just volunteer at the masjid, and it would come out of like being sitting in the masjid and being like, I don't like the way this program went, you know, and I don't like how this happened or whatever. And then going up to like elders and being like, you know, you guys should change this. And then being like, you know, make a committee, do something like that. And I actually kind of really grew up in this institutional structure that I think exists a lot in our community, where a mosque will have a committee, or a nonprofit, like, you know, you're doing organizing in a boardroom, you're using a whiteboard, and you're kind of doing like a needs assessment. And for me, I think those things are valid, but what has really changed in my definition of organizing is the process, and thinking about the power dynamics that come with the people who are able to kind of sit and try to create this analysis or make this change happen. So I'm really trying to push back on the structures of that. It's like a selected few who, you know, have many privileges. Like, you know, we speak English, we're college educated, you know, we come from certain backgrounds, you know, we're documented, etc. And we're the ones who kind of get to be put in a room or get the job where we're doing a needs assessment on our community and figuring out how to put that in action. I think that organizing should really, like Hoda said, involve the people that are the most vulnerable, and the people who really don't get to have a voice, or that we just ignore their voices, you know? So are we speaking to our congregations, or is it just the imam and like the board who's making decisions for the congregations? Are we speaking to our community members, the ones who are undocumented, who don't speak English, you know, who are really facing the actual realities of what these state-sponsored policies mean to our communities, to what Islamophobia and racism and being undocumented means in this country? All of those things, are we really asking those people for their opinions and asking them what they want to change, and actually giving people the tools to make that change, rather than me as an, you know, professionalized organizer being like, I'm gonna do the rally, or I'm going to hold the panel, etc. So I want to challenge my own working definition of community organizing with myself first, and I think that our community is kind of going to work its way through that, of us really thinking about who we should center and who we should ask first when we're trying to make decisions. Because, you know, it's like, you know, it's very simple. It's, you're trying to move people towards something, but who are you? Who's the person who's trying to move them, you know? And why, you know, questioning yourself in that position. So that's a little bit about my own journey of trying to define that. I don't think I really have a definition, but, you know, constantly working through it.
Yeah, I really love that. I mean, in wrestling with these fluid definitions, and I liked how you expanded the understanding of what is organizing. So May, let's go into your definition, and then how does it relate to your work?
Yeah, thank you everybody for your contributions. Hoda, what really resonates with me is trying to come together and build the world that you want to live in. And as you had mentioned too, not putting the expectation that it's going to happen in the moment. That's what an organizer understands versus an activist. And I think in this era, something that is much more much more a part of the conversations that we're having in community organizing spaces is what is the difference between an activist and an organizer, right? And so Lakota tradition, they operate and organize on this earth with the understanding that what they do now is only going to be seen 7 generations down the road. So what kind of detachment from nefs do you have to say that this might not even benefit me now, right? And that we're also doing this work, as you mentioned, Hoda, for the ancestors and full progenies down the line. So with that kind of lineage in mind, and with that centering of something outside of yourself, community organizing. But in terms of a working definition, I call on a lot of people that have influenced me, like Stokely Carmichael, who has an amazing speech on the difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. He sees Malcolm as a organizer and a mobilizer, but he sees King only as a mobilizer. So Malcolm X in prison organized for Muslim rights. This is before he becomes fully realized as a Muslim preacher and a national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. Whereas you have a Martin Luther King who writes a letter from Birmingham jail. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they were playing different roles and they were doing different things. So that is one interesting example that Kwame Ture brings to the table. And so how I kind of interpret this is that what an organizer does in distinction to the mobilizer or the activist is that if you go to a rally, the activist is the one protesting on the front lines, and the organizer has created the space for this to happen and created the conversation and the community relationships that have put the bodies at the rally, and then we'll continue towards imagining either policy or building and developing more community engagement around the issue that is being protested. So I think it's important for us to understand the distinction because, as Hoda said in the beginning of this conversation, there's a real desire and drive to commodify the activist in this era of quote unquote resistance. And so if we can the community organizer and the activist, and I know I still didn't give a working definition, but the way that I think is in terms of this sort of like contrasting opposites and this dialectic. And the organizer, I think about yoga, actually. We talk about how we organize ourselves in the asanas or in the postures. And what you do is you intelligently order the relationships within your body. And I think you can also transfer that to understanding what you do in a community. You intelligently order the relationships within that community. And as Grace Lee Boggs, amazing Chinese American radical revolutionary activist who passed away a couple of years ago, she said that you organize 1 mile deep and 1 inch wide. So for her, it's really an emphasis about being rooted in community to affect the change on the ground, and to go very deeply. And she has an amazing, really short, understandable, and accessible article called Organization Meets Commitment, where she explores, you know, some of these differences that we see between the activist who is activated or can be mobilized, or the mobilizer in that moment, versus somebody who's in it for the long fight.
Yeah, that is just really amazing. What really comes to mind is from early on, following Mike Brown's death, and looking at the responses from our elders, like African American Muslim elders who were pioneers, and I remember Suad Abdul Khabir was talking about her mother and her mother's friends who were part of the nation, and like a lot of the sisters and brothers, like our elders were like Black Panthers also. And what's interesting when you think about the lineage of the Black Panthers, I mean, they're coming from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, and so like Ella Baker was the organizer behind that, and so we imagine all the work being done by Martin Luther King, but we don't remember the organizer behind that trained these young people, that put their bodies on the front line and created the spectacle that demonstrated the violence of white supremacy and eventually they got tired of it. Like, I mean, we're just like, okay, we need to build power, right? So this idea of like building power, and how did this, take shape in the Black community? And so many of these, of our elders were like, well, what is the protest going to do? And then what? And so while they were organizing, like, so in Baltimore, the Muslim community were feeding people, and,
Yes.
they were keeping people safe, and, they were, like, there was just a lot that they were doing, and it wasn't all, like, especially for the Black Muslims, it wasn't all the kind of sexy stuff you see on TV, like with the actions, but Muslims have always been organizing. I guess, like, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit. So I spent like a 3-day weekend doing with LA Voice, which is a multi-faith, multiracial community organizing group. So 3 days we went over organizing. And so, with the idea of organizing, and they take the Alinsky model, which you can look up the Alinsky model, like where they work on organizing congregations and to affect policy. And so, and I just like looked up quickly this definition that and I think it's Thought Co. It's like, community organizing is a process by which a group of people organizes and takes measures to influence policies or culture surrounding them. And so some people, like, originally it started local, but now we have networks of people. So it's like the people that, in focusing on the people that are affected, where they determine what are the things that are shaping their lives, and what can they change. And so it's not all pie in the sky, where, like with LA Voice, like that's actually influenced our work at MuslimARC, was to when we saw that Muslims, like people with Isla LA and LAUMA, which is Latino Muslim organization, they canvassed the streets. They worked in South Central to help pass Prop 47, which turned which turned felonies into misdemeanors, freeing up millions of dollars for education. And so they still work in collaboration in these multiracial, multi-faith groups to envision a Los Angeles that, helping passing laws to make sure undocumented people have a driver's license, so then they can get insurance. And, this affects people's lives of working to, pass sanctuary, working to change banking laws that, and increase housing. So, community organizing has it's a real effect. And when we had moved to Los Angeles area, like I live in the Inland Empire, inland region, I saw racial justice organizing as the key. Like, we can focus on hurt feelings or focus on, anti-bias, but we're not going to address the system. And so, we're not going to address the implicit bias or the structural racism without organizing. And so MuslimARC, our role is kind of playing a part in educating, raising awareness about how to bring about racial justice as a whole, because that's getting at the root. So I
also wanted to just quickly add on the point of organizing. I think that it's also something that I failed to do, and I need to constantly work on, at least. And I think that it's also something that as organizers we need to be aware of, and we all kind of mentioned that it's important to be centering those who we're trying to stand in solidarity with, but that also means that we have to actively be finding that lack. So where there is a lack of representation within the organizing spaces, we need to be actively going and collaborating with those communities. So for example, in non-Muslim Black communities, a lot of Muslim immigrants don't tend to take up a lot of space or aren't reached out to. But in a lot of Muslim spaces, Black immigrants also aren't reached out to, or even non-immigrant Black people aren't reached out to who are Muslim. And so I think there's a kind of a population that seems to be excluded from a lot of different spaces, even though they're sitting at a lot of different intersections. And so I think while we also need to be centering those who are in our community already, we need to be actively finding and identifying that lack that we also have, and seeking them and actively going to work with them as well.
Could I add 2 more points to that, actually? And I thought this is something we didn't cover, but I think is worth mentioning, and that is community organizing and leadership. So within a community organizing framework, you have probably a different understanding of what a leader is and who a leader would constitute. So for example, we've heard the phrase, we're the leaders we've been waiting for, right? That is like been attributed to Ella Baker, but artist, activist, organizer June Jordan said it. Grace Lee Boggs says something really interesting, and she says, creating an organizational structure to develop every member into a leader instead of depending on few charismatic leaders. That's how she understands community organizing and the relationship to leadership. And right, as Hoda was talking about, where the lack is usually who, and not understanding how to develop leaders within the community, as opposed to self-assuming that, or assuming the position of leader. And I want to also add, the kind of informality of organizing to make it accessible to people. Umi Salah of Dream Defenders says that if you can organize a house party, you are an organizer.
Yeah.
Like for us to understand, and as you were saying, Abir, just going to the mosque and feeling like not vibing with things and organizing against it, or organizing for a new vision. We are active organizers in our lives, and for us to recognize when we're doing those things and sitting and trying to analyze it, we do develop a structure, a conversation, and a definition around what organizing is and looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, also, I mean, all of like it's just like a Muslim like diaspora thing. Like everyone's on WhatsApp. They have like these huge WhatsApp chains, like if we can just like tap into that and say, how about instead of sending that like really bad joke, why don't you just like send out like a know your rights guide, and our people are already organized, that we just need to make sure that we're tapping into systems that already are there.
Yeah, totally making memes viral on WhatsApp, right?
Margari, do you mind if I give like an example of something that I saw in New York City that kind of for me defined a lot of this? So I'm sure, I feel like a lot of people heard about this Yemeni bodega strike that happened kind of the week of the Muslim ban when it came out in, I think, February. So in New York City, there, we have like bodegas, we have, and many of the bodegas, they shut down one day, and it was about like, I think like hundreds, maybe like 800 bodegas shut down. And it was this massive kind of rally that happened, and people were amazed because this really was something where it was a population of people who don't normally come out, and because Yemen was mentioned in the Muslim ban, and there was this ban for people coming in from Yemen, this kind of thing happened really organically within a few days. Now, kind of going on to like what a lot of people were saying of, I think that one thing is that community organizing is often devalued. And I think that a lot of I think there's a lot of work that women do in community organizing that, again, is also kind of invisibilized and devalued as well. So for this strike that happened, the way it really kind of went down, regardless of what you saw, you probably saw people give speeches and you saw pictures of like all of these people show up to a rally, but it was a lot of women who were just calling up their neighbors and their friends and being like, hey, did you hear about this strike? You should like convince your husband who owns the bodega to shut down. And even though like a lot of the bodegas were run by men, a lot of men worked in the bodegas, it was really through the work of like women, aunts and mothers and cousins who were just spreading the word informally on WhatsApp and things like that, and convincing their brothers, their cousins, their husbands, their uncles to shut down these bodegas. So there was a lot of like behind the scenes stuff that happened, and it goes to Maytha was saying about like the people who really build the relationships to make sure that people get there, and are comfortable there, who's getting everyone on the subway and making sure that happens to get to the location, and making sure everyone is fed, and making sure there's childcare, and just all of these little pieces that people just don't normally think about. And I think that is the work of organizers. It's one, to like Hoda said, you're identifying all of the people that are not there, but then also you're identifying all of the needs. You know, you're thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to bring women who, you know, like normally, you know, let's say immigrant women who can't even show up to these spaces normally, are we going to provide them fare for, like, you know, their rides? Are we going to provide childcare for them? You know, are we going to help bring translation for them? So thinking about all those little pieces. And I've learned a lot through witnessing this happen. Sometimes I see things go down and, you know, I can tell that there's something missing there. And sometimes I see things that happen very beautifully, and it's because of these little intimate details that people think about.
Yeah, that's such a powerful example. So I want to kind of move into kind of what motivates people to organize. Like what, so I guess we can, you know, maybe we could start with May, like if you could talk about kind of like religious scriptures or texts or some example from our sacred history that informs some of your organizing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like this could be a hour-long conversation or more, or a full day, because obviously there's a plethora of stories in terms of the emphasis around freedom, justice, equity. But as I've been talking about lately, I've developed this concept around shahada, which is the profession of faith. It's considered the first pillar. We all know this, but for the non-Muslims watching, the very first words we're supposed to utter is, I witness, right? Mm-hmm. And so I've been really interested in this idea of the difference between witnessing, the political act of witness in Islam, versus the way it's communicated in English or outside of the space of Islam, right? So what does it mean to say that witness and testify, and in the Quran is repeatedly referred to in terms of witnessing and testifying in the way of justice? So that's the ayah 4, Surah 4, ayah 135 talks about being and taking shahada in the way of justice, right? And so for me, I've kind of developed this concept of an engaged witness. What does it mean for us to sit and watch injustice, and how that very act of witnessing forces us to be in service of justice, forces us to change the conditions to what we are witnessing. So the phrase that I give to also think about how shahid also means martyr is to consider the very act of witnessing an injustice, possibly killing and dying off a part of yourself, and you can only be reborn in the telling. Mm. For me, Islam, the commitment to Islam compels me to continue to be reborn. And so that's a big sort of impetus for the work that I do. I mean, I was in Lisbon when I got an alert on my phone that Michael Brown was murdered on August 9th. And I was with my sister, and I was like, I'm going to go in the center of Lisbon and hold up a sign, or I'm going to go back to Ferguson. I saw what was happening, and I couldn't help but be a part of it. But of course, like an activist, and so this goes back to our conversation around an activist and an organizer, an activist would say, okay, I need to go. But the organizer in me said, okay, let's wait and hear what the community wants in terms of from the outside coming in and helping and joining their movement. So anytime I see something, I'm like the Where's Waldo of events that go down sometimes. I can't believe I wasn't at Baltimore. You know, when things were going down in Palestine, I helped organize a group of people who were involved in the Ferguson uprising to go to Palestine, because there was this discursive connection being made between Ferguson and Palestine and transnational sort of support. So I don't know, there's something in me that I cannot sustain this desire I have, the conditions or the prevailing circumstances. that from the way that I read and understand, witness through not only Islam, but through this, I mean, not only through the scriptures, but through the seerah. And the spiritual sort of commitment to this work.
No, it's very powerful. Maybe, Hoda, can you share what traditions or sacred history inspires your work?
Yes. Can you see me? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah. Just rubber stamp on everything Maytha just said. She's so eloquent and with everything that she said. And also, as a Shia Muslim, I also want to bring this perspective specifically to the table. I think social justice is very much centered in Shia practicing of Islam. And that's why, you know, the stories of Ali or Ashura are so central to our practicing and celebration of the faith, is because these stories really embody the struggling in the face of oppression and selflessness and all of these sorts of ideals and virtues that we hope to live up to as Muslims and individuals. So I think that's also why a lot of Shias believe that there is so much anti-Shia violence in the Middle East, is just because of the fact that there's always kind of like this social justice framework that we work from. We haven't really, I mean, we have, but like, for example, American or Western imperialism tends to be anti-Shia specifically as well, given the history of Shias and the West, and sort of the constant pushback of Western imperialism in many Shia countries or with Shia minorities. But I want to also mention that it's important to note that oftentimes within the Muslim community, a lot of times specific tenets of faith, especially about like being loving toward every single person, and this centering on compassion and love also is used a lot of times by people to also silence organizers and activists and saying, oh, don't, you're too loud, you're causing too many problems. We should be appreciating and loving everyone who wants to help us, even if it's like someone who's exacerbating microaggressions and things like this. And one of my good friends and co-organizers, so Sufia Sami, she volunteers at this refugee center here in Chicago, and there is someone who, I mean, basically, we're talking about how, like, the fact that Muslims and refugees have gone through so much violence. You know, they've crossed borders on foot, they've been human trafficked, they've seen their family killed in front of their faces. They've gone through all of this struggle only to come here and have to be appreciative of a white woman who is also perpetuating microaggressions. Like, that's ridiculous, you know? And so when we're challenging that and saying, no, we need to have more Muslims in this space, we shouldn't be kind of bowing down and kissing the hands of like our oppressors when they decided to finally say one thing nice or finally want to volunteer at a space or something. But I think oftentimes because of the inherent love and compassion of Islam, we're sometimes too quick to appreciate people who actually are exacerbating microaggressions. And so we need to be aware of that. And in fact, it's quite contrary, I think, to the faith to be like accepting this, because we are allowing harm to be happening toward other Muslims, and we're allowing harm to be continuing to happening if we're not going to say, no, what you're doing is not okay, please leave this space. No matter how much you want to help Muslims, the fact that you refuse to admit that they have a cultural identity, admit that they have names that are different, you know, all of these just like very small things. If you can't accept that, and you can't work in a space with Muslims without perpetuating microaggressions or larger macroaggressions, then you shouldn't be in that space, and we don't have to be thankful for that. And I think that's something that I really want to also push for Muslims, is to not sort of to have higher standards for yourself, for your faith, and for other Muslims around you, to not just accept anybody who walks by who's offering you like a piece of food.
Yeah, I just want to kind of add, it seems with our faith, or, you know, the kind of method that, you know, most of us typically use is like that the scripture and traditions, it's excavation, you know, like, so a lot of people, like, they look for an you know, something that would justify what they do, rather than looking for traditions or values that may actually cause them discomfort, you know. So, you know, so sometimes, like, that idea of standing up, you know, and speaking firmly to people who are in power, or people who, you know, because, like, who gets that niceness is typically people who have privilege. And so, but, like, they'll use a text, or they'll use a tradition of hospitality to justify why they may be appeasing white supremacy. And so, you know, or whatever thing that they're doing. So I think that's something, you know, even within our context of, like, not making what we do as universal and hegemonic, but understanding that each individual, often we choose things in our faith that, you know, like, that make it easier, or just, like, something that affirms what we already believe or want to do, rather than finding sometimes things it's like, okay, I really want to be wealthy, or, you know, or whatever, but it's just like, but because my faith says this, I must, you know, choose this path. And that's, like, that delicate line we have to draw, right? So Aber, I want you to, you know, share the religious scripture traditions that inspire you.
Man, okay. I mean, I'm like thinking about what you're saying. I just really want to re-highlight that notion of choosing the things that make you uncomfortable. You know, I think that one of the things about Islam that really is important to me is the idea of the constant self-accountability. And that, like, I feel like if I wasn't rooted in this faith tradition, I don't know if I would think about just my deeds, my actions so much, about, like, just the way that I am interacting with this world as much, and holding myself accountable to, like, what am I doing right and what am I doing wrong, and then what that means if it's done, you know, on a greater level, and it's not just, like, me as my own kind of self. But I kind of want to trace back to my own kind of journey. I think it's easy to pull out something from the scripture, but for me, like, Islam is really self-explanatory. I think that Islam is something that can be used and co-opted and interpreted in ways that are oftentimes, like, problematic, and can be used to perpetuate, you know, power dynamics and oppression. But for me, you know, just the basic concepts of Islam, of, like, just my understanding of Sira, or just understanding that, like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the highest, like, and is the highest, and yet always in the Quran, the stories and the people that we're supposed to be accountable to are, like, the people who are considered the lowest in society. And that's, like, what Islam is asking of us, you know, from, like, the prophetic stories to just even, like, the explanation of the Sira, and how, like, society was reorganized through this concept of Islam to eradicate kind of these, like, identities and the power dynamics that were held in a society. But more personally for me, it was really just kind of like the physical experience of being Muslim that I feel is what draws me to social justice in Islam. I feel like I became more devout or more interested in Islam really very typically as, like, a post 9/11 child who was experiencing the policies, you know, the Islamophobic policies happen within my own household, and how they were affecting my parents and my childhood, and feeling, you know, really like I couldn't belong in my own society, and finding a place of belonging within my masjid, within my congregation. And again, that idea of congregation, and unfortunately the idea that, like, Islam has this really beautiful sense where it gives us this shared language amongst each other. Like, all four of us on this panel, we say, like, the Muslim community, and we kind of, like, all know what that means, and it's, like, a super complex meaning, but, like, we all know what it means, you know. And also just the idea of, you know, people standing next to one another, people having a shared space, and identifying with people all over the world who, subhanAllah, like, in this time are also oppressed, always gave me, like, a non-hegemonic identity. I feel, you know, I was living in a world where you had these identities that were, like, imposed on you, like these, like, Western values and identities that you were supposed to constantly, like, kind of adopt and assimilate into. And yet, like, being Muslim and understanding that my identity, somehow I understood what like people being bombed in Iraq, I not even if I understood, but I felt connected to them, and I felt like these were the people who I had to fight for, right? Just through that kind of shared identity was really important for me as like a way to center myself in social justice, this kind of like affiliating with the oppressed, right? And seeing yourself as someone amongst them. I will also say that like in our community, that like this again can really be used against us, right? Because you can say like subhanallah, Islam, and like connecting to a billion people and like kumbaya, but also like we need that community accountability. So over time, something that I realized was, one, I had a point in my life where I felt like I didn't belong, and I found belonging in institutions, right? And like Muslim institutions in masajid, or, you know, MSAs or groups like that. Over time, I also grew to understand that there were many people, almost majority of Muslims, who actually weren't also identifying with those institutions, who weren't feeling a sense of belonging within those institutions. Our community wasn't accountable to people, and isn't accountable to so many people. And we're not really always practicing those principles. So now my sense of like belonging in the Muslim community is, I think, more fluid. It doesn't necessarily, I don't attach myself to a space, but I think I attach myself to the concept of really having that love, that compassion within my, like, you know, within people who share this faith with me, but thinking about who's excluded, and trying to create space and safety for people who are excluded, and feeling safe amongst those people. SubhanAllah, even now, like there's a sense of non-belonging in institutions, but then I find a sense of belonging with people who are not necessarily connected to that, but we share these common values, and not everybody looks exactly what the poster child of Islam looks like, you know, but for me, that common language, that common way of being able to like see yourself beyond yourself, that like Islam gives you, is something that really has like rooted me in thinking about social justice.
Yeah, that's really
also.
Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say that's really, really beautiful, and I'll let May go, and then I'll kind of add my little insertion in there. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, Aber, sorry, also inspired me, because the things that like really drove the ummah, the concept of the ummah, the international brotherhood, sisterhood, whatever, kinship you want to call it. And you see this all over Malcolm X's travel diaries. He's inspired by moments and practices and interactions that he sees as ones that put brotherhood and sisterhood or kinship on the forefront. Islam practice when he travels, and similar with me. And as Aber was saying, you also get disillusioned as well, because you see this shared language and these principles that we talk about, and we see a huge lapse on the masajid around these concepts, or in some of our community spaces, and that can be disheartening. And so what keeps us going is this beautiful concept of being rooted in the teachings of the faith, as you were talking about, Aber. And the last thing I'll say is, I mean, every single time that we're in salat or we are reciting surahs, we say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we, in the name of mercy. How beautiful is that? I just, also the beauty, the poetry of our sacred tradition and our scriptures, that to me also connects back to the way that I see art as one of the most penultimate methods and modes for organizing people, and organizing and bringing us a imagination around the world that we want to live in. So those are the other things that I draw from, and thank you for giving me a chance to speak again, Margari.
Well, thank you. So, I mean, I wanted to just kind of add, I think, I mean, well, it's very important when we're thinking about organizing of centering those who are the most oppressed. I mean, we have the examples from the Sira. It's like the orphans, the, you know, like we have like the elderly, the feeding the poor, and you know, I mean, that was like what the Quraysh, like what actually made fun of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam about was like, you know, like, oh, you just have all these young people and people who aren't powerful that follow you. And so, you know, I mean, it's that, you know, and then speaking for justice, even if it goes against your own kin and family. And so that's like where a lot of people, where they challenge their own, you know, like they may actually go against their own kind of self-interest for the sake of justice. And that's a very powerful thing. I think, well, one thing that was coming to mind is that when we're talking about like, there's now a lot of work where we're trying to do is like organize in Muslim communities. And what I had noticed a lot of times, and, you know, sometimes like there's a tendency to talk about our congregations, like our mosques, as spaces that are unwelcoming, but then how, and then sometimes like in organizing spaces, where like people may have a certain, sometimes like negative views about the people that they wish to organize, you know, like,
Yeah.
like if we're gonna organize Muslims, and there's like this kind of opposition, right? So and that comes from like different political views. And I think that's the kind of challenge, is like in some ways of meeting people where they're at, of understanding their kind of worldviews, and not always like adopting certain frameworks that actually don't come from us, but are from a kind of secular humanist framework, which is hegemonic, and using that framework as analysis, or even the disposability of people because they don't have the same politics as some of the organizers. And I say this as somebody who doesn't really, I don't like, I mean, I came into Islam as part of the kind of Black radical tradition, and then following, you know, like Malcolm X, and you know, like, and I am pretty much a very, you know, I mean, I don't like to use like traditional, like, I mean, it's like I have like, I mean, I guess I'm beyond the kind of right, left, or those binaries. And I think there's people that kind of struggle with that. So I guess like when we think about, like, what is, like, I'm gonna go off like script a little bit, but what is the future of organizing? Like, I mean, what do Muslims need to do? I mean, in this climate right now, like where we have, you know, active, like we have an active Muslim ban, and we have like this registry that may happen. There's like, you know, like now we're going into like really tough policing. And so, you know, what is the next steps for us who wish to combat, both like from the local level to the state and the federal? What are some next steps that we need to do to organize our community? So everybody, you get like 1 minute to sum it up. Master plan.
Master plan. Oh my God.
I can go first.
Yeah.
If you guys want to think. I might not have a good answer since I went first, but for me, I think that I'm thinking about like what you just said about how sometimes we even like look at our own traditions like negatively, or our own communities negatively, and kind of draw from other. And for me, like, it's important to draw from other, but recently I just am trying to figure out ways to find my orientation from social justice coming from Islam, you know, like coming from liberation theologies from Islam, seeing Islam as a framework of changing society. Kind of like, it's like going back to your ancestry in a way, because I think that so many times like we're getting Islamic interpretation that is kind of defined by other interpretations, or humanistic interpretations, etc. So is Islam a framework for decoloniality? Is Islam a framework for social justice? Is Islam a framework for community organizing? And what is that framework? What are those models? How do we draw from that? And how do we share that so that our communities are finding themselves in the struggle, you know, finding their own tradition in the struggle, and self-identifying. So bringing that to community, being able to disseminate that down, all of that is really important to me. I think that like sometimes we preach down to Muslims, and I want us to give the dignity to Muslims in saying that like Islam has all the tools that you need. It's just that we have to find those, and we have to interpret those, and we have to bring that about. I don't know if it's a great answer. That's my answer. You gave me a minute.
Okay, May? You have May, or did we lose? Well, we'll go
Sorry.
to okay.
Sorry. I was on mute. With what I've been thinking about a lot, not just Muslim communities, but communities in general. There is this drive, this sense of urgency to react in this moment. And while we need folks to do that, in again, this kind of framework around the activist and the organizer, there are communities of organizers that have been doing the work for a while, right? And I think that part of how we organize is trying to understand, one, the lay of the land, who's doing what, and also giving support and empowerment to the people that are already doing the work on the ground, like you, Margari, have been doing the work for a while. So, you know, if somebody's like, man, I have to come and start educating my community on anti-racism work, they can link up with MuslimARC, right? Again, just kind of educating ourselves of the lay of the land, educating ourselves about our faith, as Aber was talking about, and then also history about how this has been happening, right? This is not the first ban on Muslims to this country, and this is not going to be the last. And if we understand systems of power, if we understand theories, if we understand philosophy, if we teach ourselves that, and I mean, this is going to sound unglamorous and unsexy, we're in reading groups together. Like, that's the power of the work we could be doing. There is more sort of sexy work on a local level, but, you know, in my, like, you know, to wrap it up, in my sort of master plan, my deepest imagination is how we can create like transnational divestment campaigns from companies and organizations and systems and the US government that will still profit out of our consumption, right? So how are we continuing to empower those who want to death? We have the power. We just need to recognize ways that we can work together to target, you know, like simple sort of things in terms of divestment from the commodity industry. So
love it. Yes.
Everything. Yeah, 100%. I mean, this might be a cop-out answer of what is our master plan, but to make a strategy, like I seriously think we need to make a strategy. And as a group of people, we need to get our shit together. I think a lot of what Margari also said and what May said as well is that we need to identify who's already doing the work, and we need to not try to be the first one to like do the work. We need to just connect with people who are already doing it and then see what the gaps are and where the lacks are and fill in that, rather than, just as May said, we don't need to all be doing the sexy work right now. We need to find out what we need to be doing, what is lacking, and then filling in that space. So definitely we need to have more communication with each other. We need to be able to get on the same page. And I love that this call is like all the way from California all the way to the East Coast. And we need to be doing more things like this. We need to be bringing people from around the states to be able to have these conversations and learn from each other and grow from each other, but also make this global, you know, because anti-Muslim racism isn't just affecting Muslims here, it's affecting our people abroad too. And so the only way that we can really move forward is to keep that people in mind and keep the people who are always systematically silenced in mind. So that's everyone who's abroad, all of these people who are victims of drone strikes, surveillance both here and abroad, and these systems of profit that are actually building themselves a political career, an economic career, their whole livelihoods off of violence against Muslims. And so it's integral that we are able to build and have mass community education programs. Like, I think that we should have teach-ins, you know, we need to be talking about our histories. It needs to be intergenerational. Just as May said, this is not the first Muslim ban. When there are thoughts of a Muslim registry, there's already been a Muslim registry, you know, and everyone, all the white people who are like, I'll sign up first. No white people signed up. And we need to be able to learn from people who have experienced this, who have already gone through this, and say, okay, what was lacking at that point in time? Why did we fail as a community? And so we can learn and continue to get better. So I think that anything that we do needs to be intergenerational, it needs to be global, and it needs to be intersectional. And this is the last I mean, there's no time to like have like anti-Black racism, but right now is the last time that Muslims should be able to harbor anti-Black racism, anti-queer views, homophobia, transphobia, classism, all of these sort of isms that are holding us down and dividing us. If we don't get over this and we're not able to educate each other and come and get like beyond these divisive sort of ideologies, nothing's going to happen. There's no way that we'll be able to progress if we're not intentionally working with other groups, because we're in this all together. There's no way that just Muslims are going to get free and then we'll be like, well, we're good, you know, working with everybody else. And so I think what we need to be doing is finding these sort of central targets of solidarity, intentional solidarity. So for example, a fusion center, which takes information and creates no-fly lists, creates terrorist quote-unquote lists, and also has gang databases, you know, so it has lots of lists of human beings on that list that will expand through different intersections. And so Muslims, Latinx people, Black people can all come together to fight fusion centers. It's a shared target.
Yeah. So I want to wrap up because we're like 5 minutes over. And I'll do the kind of plug for MuslimARC, like what May is saying. I mean, as a very intersectional group, like we have people with multiple identities, like as far as like with this work, and we are a collaborative, so we work with partners, local partners on the ground, and work to like provide both like resources to help raise up their narrative of the work that they're doing, and we partner with groups and like this too, like where a lot of you know, I'm sure a lot of people that are watching this have not known about your work that you're doing on the ground. And so, you know, like we really work and we're working to convene spaces. So our next plug, I mean, this month in August, inshallah, we'll actually bring back our guests. Like we had a convening in Los Angeles for the Black Atlantic Transnational Islamophobia and Student Organizing. So we'll bring Yasser Luati, Malia Buatia, and Adam Moose, and Hannah D. And May. Like we'll have like an amazing talk about this national work, and we'll continue that through this through the year. Like as we talk, like we're actually doing some working papers and recommendations for this. So we'll have a report from the convening. So be on the lookout in August. MuslimARC is also we're having our Detroit anti-racism training. And that's so that's in September, so September 15th. So, you know, like we hope everyone comes out to that. So if you want to, you know, have a space where we're talking about issues like water, we're talking about the registries, we're expanding sanctuary to create, you know, caring communities. So we'll be doing work on that, but definitely follow us. You know, even if folks are involved in doing anti-racism work or their solidarity work, as a collaborative, we're here to support and to amplify, but also we create for those who may not have the same accessibility issues. We do have online trainings, and we'll continue with webinars and trainings to really strengthen the work, that we can have a shared language and tools to do that kind of local work for systems change, but also to have the skills for multiracial solidarity, which includes minimizing our microaggressions or understanding how, you know, like the systems, like how we could work better together. So on that, I mean, we're totally over like 10 minutes, but we appreciate everyone who stayed. Please follow us at MuslimARC.org. Like our page, follow us, and please join us. We have subscription membership, so you can access our trainings and but also contribute to this work. We love contributions, and we have our members are across the country, and we do convenings locally, like as long, you know, like, so even if you are, we have members in Canada, and even in Pakistan at one time. She's now back in the States. So please keep following us, and please keep supporting us. I want to give a special shout out to a very pioneering and actually somebody that I consider a mentor, two mentors, so Shamar Hempel and Rami Nashashibi of Iman Central, and Sarah Hamdan, who is amazing. She was one of the first people that helped start MuslimARC. Like, her vision helped get us kick-started. And so, you know, they really changed my life, and I really appreciate them. And then all the brothers and sisters, named and unnamed, who were organizers, that their hard work have allowed us to be where we're at. So we appreciate you. Jazakallah khair, everyone. Thank you, and we'll be seeing you soon, inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.